Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Why is President Trump deploying U.S. troops to U.S. cities? Let's get to the bottom line. He calls it the war from within. U.S. President Donald Trump has been dispatching large numbers of National Guard forces to a number of American cities, from Los Angeles to here in Washington. He says these cities are unsafe and crime-infested, especially the ones managed by elected Democrats, and that his crackdown on immigrants needs backup. In a speech to the U.S. military's top brass, Trump told them that American forces should use American cities as, quote, training grounds for our military, and that his enemies inside the country are no different than a foreign enemy. His critics argue that this is not what U.S. troops are for, and his actions are a straight-up power play against his political opponents meant to quash dissent, not to fight crime in a meaningful way. So by going on a war footing inside the United States, what is Donald Trump hoping to achieve? Today we're talking with Kori Schake, a former U.S. official at the National Security Council, the State Department, and the Pentagon, currently at the American Enterprise Institute, and she's just coming out with her latest book, The State and the Soldier, A History of Civil-Military Relations in the United States. Kori, thank you for joining us. Your timing couldn't be better. Everyone is talking about this, what's going on with the deployment of troops, but I want to read something you wrote a year ago, and it is eerily prescient in my view. You write, one specific scenario I worry about is President Trump, enabled by an enfeebled Congress and more ruthlessly competent advisors, to issue legal orders for the military to engage in violent suppression of domestic protest or to execute arrest warrants for the president's political opponents. The president has unchecked constitutional authority to declare an insurrection is occurring and deploy our military forces to use violence against their fellow Americans. Trump wanted to do it in 2020, and he's threatening it now. Well, we've just seen James Comey arrested. We've seen the deployment of troops. What did you see that so many other people didn't see in the actions of President Trump?
That the 1807 Insurrection Act actually leaves the president an enormous amount of authority for the use of active duty American military for domestic law enforcement. The president has unchecked authority if he invokes the Insurrection Act. If he doesn't, I mean, there are basically three ways an American president can use our military in domestic circumstances. Mostly he is constrained by an 1878 legislation, the Posse Comitatus Act, which requires either Congress to use its statutory authority to permit the president in specific instances, or for governors to request assistance. The only other way that the president can use the American military for domestic law enforcement is if he invokes the Insurrection Act. But if he does that, he has very wide latitude to act, and that's what was clear a year ago.
Can you give us a little more on the Posse Comitatus Act? That I think that's a term many Americans have never heard of, don't know well, and certainly many people who are watching this around the world and wondering what's going on is how is our system allowing that? So you've basically laid out, here is this act, we'd love to hear a little bit more, and then there's a way to derail it, which I don't think people realized was there either.
Yeah, so the Posse Comitatus Act comes with the end of Reconstruction after the American Civil War. I mean,
we're talking 1860.
Yeah, so the states that seceded after the Confederacy was defeated on the battlefield, the Union military occupied those states in order to serve as a government before they were readmitted as states to the Union, and to protect the constitutional rights of American citizens, including Black Americans. After 10, 12 years of this, even in the Union states, there was exhaustion with the occupation of the American South. There was a contested American presidential election, and part of the political agreement was the end of the military occupation of the southern states. And the Posse Comitatus Act is the legislation that, in which that was enshrined, which said that the American military cannot be used for domestic law enforcement unless Congress specifically authorizes it by statute, or governors request assistance, or the president invokes the Insurrection Act.
How by any measure that you think is reasonable, is an Insurrection Act invocation appropriate in any of these cities that we're seeing?
It's not appropriate. I mean, what the president said to the military leadership at Quantico was that Washington, D.C. was more violent than anything they experienced during the war in Afghanistan, which is just abject nonsense. And so both the Insurrection Act and the Posse Comitatus Act serve to limit the ability of the president to use the American military for domestic repression. They're both limiting legislation. And what's so dangerous is the way the president has flipped the arrow on that and is using them, testing the legal and constitutional boundaries of his authority in order to use the American military domestically. Despite what the president said, we do not have a phalanx of domestic enemies that need to be suppressed by military force. But, for example, when George Washington invoked the predecessor to the Insurrection Act during the Whiskey Rebellion, he had to have a Supreme Court justice agree with his judgment that an insurrection was occurring. That requirement was stripped out of the Insurrection Act in 1807, and it'd be a really good idea to limit the president's authority under the Insurrection Act because it's legislation. We have the ability to change it and restrict these questionable uses much more tightly.
Let's listen to the president himself in his own words talk about what's going on. Let's listen.
Only in recent decades did politicians somehow come to believe that our job is to police the far reaches of Kenya and Somalia while America is under invasion from within. We're under invasion from within. No different than a foreign enemy, but more difficult in many ways because they don't wear uniforms. At least when they're wearing a uniform, you can take them out. These people don't have uniforms. But we are under invasion from within. We're stopping it very quickly. After spending trillions of dollars defending the borders of foreign countries, with your help, we're defending the borders of our country from now on.
Could you ever imagine obviously you could imagine hearing a president of the United States say words like that because you wrote something very similar a year ago about what your fears were. But I have to admit that I can't believe I'm listening to a president sort of talk about an enemy within with such ferocity. Who is that enemy that he's talking about?
So I share your shock to hear a president of the United States speak of our fellow Americans in that way. And who he evidently means is the people of Los Angeles, the people of Chicago, the people of Washington, D.C. And it's just outright fiction. And the suggestion that law and order, which is principally a mayoral and a gubernatorial responsibility, needs to be imposed by the federal government is a very dangerous incitement.
I want our audience to understand something about you, and tell me if I go over the line, but I've known you for a long time. You are a national security conservative. You work at a center-right think tank, the American Enterprise Institute. You worked for Republican administrations across the Pentagon, the State Department, the National Security Council. You are a unique voice in this moment because you come from the center-right space. You're not a Democrat who is, for partisan reasons, blowing the whistle on behaviors you're seeing. You're blowing the whistle because I think authentically you're very worried about the solvency of the nation and presidential leadership right now. I want our audience to know that because your voice is very unique. You're a conservative in this space, and I'm just interested in, are you at risk?
You know, I feel like my fellow Republicans are underestimating how much we should be worried about these kinds of presidential power grabs. We're not going to want it when our political adversaries exercise this kind of power. That's the secret of free societies, of democratic rule of law in a free society, is that you set the rules because you want to limit what people who don't agree with you will choose to do. And that's what we're forgetting as Republicans. And it's really dangerous for the country.
What do you think the temperature level is right now among those people that are basically within the president's camp officially, but privately, are they?
Yeah, I think the president's hearing voices of concern about the potential invocation of the Insurrection Act. In the American political system, the solutions to these problems are constitutional and they're political. You know, folks who want the military to resign over the president's choices, that would further politicize the American military in the eyes of the American public. Our military can't save us from the people we elect and appoint to high office. There are civilian solutions to that. And I agree with, I think, your suggestion that Congress is failing to exercise its Article I authorities, because that's the natural balance against executive overreach. What I thought was heartening about the Quantico meeting was that those 300 or 400 senior military leaders, NCOs and officers, they hit it exactly right. They had a duty to be present because the civilian leadership commanded it, and they had a duty not to participate in the politics. And they hit it exactly right, just the way the Joint Chiefs of Staff do at the State of the Union speech by the president before Congress. That what we should want is a military that's inert in our politics, not that saves us from our politics.
I want to underline that because you wrote a very powerful article called "Trump's Speech to Generals Was an Incitement to Violence Against Americans." Very bold headline. You go through, and you do advise the generals, don't resign, don't quit, be inert. Tell our audience what that means.
It means doing exactly what you saw the military leadership do at Quantico. They need to be responsive to legal orders, because you don't want a military that's deciding for itself whether the president's policy deserves carrying out. There's a process whereby the judge advocates general make a legal judgment, and the military abides by that legal judgment. So you don't want the military involved in the political fracas. You know, my friend Heidi Urban, a professor at Georgetown, I think says it best, which is the longest running war the American military doesn't want to fight is the American culture war. Leave them out of it. That's the safest place so that the military doesn't become an arbiter of political disputes, and so that the American public continues to have confidence and trust in its military.
I'm looking forward to reading your book, Kori, that kind of looks at the history of the state and the soldier, that looks at that relationship, the social contract, if you will, between society and those forces that stand up to defend it, which I find very important in this discussion as well. But there have been deployments of U.S. forces in the past. In the 1950s, we saw it around desegregation of schools. In the 1970s, we saw acts that turned violent in many cases, where you had National Guard and soldiers deployed inside the United States to quell protests over Vietnam, and particularly the expansion of the Vietnam War into Cambodia. And so in those moments, how do those moments differ from what we're seeing now?
So in the civil rights cases, President Eisenhower, President Kennedy, President Johnson deployed the American military domestically because the constitutional rights of American citizens were being denied by the state governments, right? So
these were black students that were not being allowed in schools, right. And so they deployed the forces to support the black students in the desegregation of schools.
That's exactly right. So Arkansas Governor Orville Fabius used the Arkansas National Guard to prevent the Little Rock Nine, those young black children, from going to school. President Eisenhower federalized the entire Arkansas National Guard to take them out of the government's control, out of the governor's control. And then he used those exact same troops deployed under federal authority to escort and protect those children going to school. What President Eisenhower was doing was enforcing the Supreme Court's decision. So that's one category of use, to uphold constitutional rights. In the Vietnam War cases, those National Guard troops actually weren't under federal authority. They were under the governor's authority. So that's a slightly different case. But in those cases, they were quelling riots on university campuses. And as you suggest, it got out of control and resulted in violence. One of the really wonderful things about the modern American military, our military now, is how disciplined and well-trained they are. I think we don't need to be concerned about the American military resorting to violence against the American public. I think they're, as the Marines proved when they were deployed to Los Angeles, they spent 2 weeks training to make sure that they were in support of the law and in support of the rights of American citizens.
You comment about that many of those people were in that room at Quantico listening to Secretary Hegseth and President Trump. Do you worry, though, that you're going to see generals like that taken out and replaced on the basis of loyalty to the president as opposed to loyalty to the Constitution?
So the president has a right to fire any military leader he wants to, and doesn't have to have a reason for it, because the American system, our military is so influential in policymaking, so popular politically, so powerful in the use of force, that it really matters that the president have trust in his senior military commanders. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the president's already fired 14 3- and 4-star officers, and you still see the discipline and the law-abiding stoicism of the American military leadership. So I don't think we need to be worried about that. What I would worry about is if the president starts giving loyalty tests, starts asking military leaders whether the 2020 election was stolen, which of course it wasn't, but the president is trying to force a relitigation of that issue. That's really dangerous. And President Trump is certainly capable of doing that, but I have a lot of confidence that our military can obey legal orders, even obey things that are lawful but awful, right? Because the public mistakenly believes that the American military can choose not to obey unethical orders. But they don't get to decide that for themselves, nor should we want them to, right?
I'll have to remember that term, lawful but awful.
It's really important. And the right people to hold accountable for that are the political leadership, not the military. The president and Congress are making decisions, and governors are making decisions about these issues. They're the people to hold accountable.
What do you think the brand, and I'm going to use their term, the Department of War is right now? And before we got this, I just want to be blunt that I think there was a sense of fatigue about ongoing wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the Middle East, not an understanding of why these deployments around the world mattered. And to some degree, we saw President Trump come up and say, all of these are bad. They were other wars and trying to get out. Now we have a different use of the military. And I'm just interested, one, what's the military for in your sense now? What should it be for? And what is the state of the American military brand?
So the first thing I would say is that part of the reason the American public and the people who fought the wars have such a bad aftertaste of them is that President Bush, President Obama, President Trump, and President Biden, none of them spent their political capital explaining to Americans why we were fighting in Iraq, why we were fighting in Afghanistan. So that's a politician's role. It's actually immoral.
So they were derelicts in your view?
Yes, it's immoral for an American president to put young men and women in harm's way without making the political case consistently and repeatedly to the American public. And none of them did that. That said, I think the brand of the American military, I mean, they continue to be one of the most trusted institutions in American public life and have been so across 80 years or so. And we saw the reason why with the discipline of those military leaders at Quantico. We saw it during the Army birthday parade, right? President Trump wanted them to march like the Chinese army, and what they did instead was invite little girls to come sit in the cockpit of a helicopter and dream about flying it for the Army one day, right? The American military understands that as a small force and a volunteer force relative to the size of our population, what the American public thinks of them really matters. It matters for recruiting, it matters for retention, it matters for the moral authority for the use of force in the world. And I think they're acquitting themselves extraordinarily well in a very difficult political time.
So I take it you don't buy the notion that crime, homelessness, transnational organized drug cartels are the reason why forces should be deployed to American cities?
No, forces should not be deployed to American cities unless mayors and governors feel like they are overwhelmed in carrying out their law enforcement responsibilities, unless Congress, by express statute, authorizes the federalization and use of military force, or unless the president invokes the Insurrection Act.
Let me ask you finally about your book, coming out, The Soldier and the State. We know that Samuel Huntington many years ago wrote The State and the Soldier. Is there any connection between those two?
Yes, I hate Sam Huntington's book.
And that's why you wrote.
Inspired me to write this history. I mean, Huntington believed that an effective military was incompatible with democracy in America. And I find that shocking. I especially find it shocking because he lived through World War II when 10 million Americans were under arms and there was almost no civil military friction. And by the way, those soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines won that war pretty decisively. So I wanted to write a history that explained how is it that a country founded in fear of a standing army came to view our military as a major bulwark of democracy. So I start with George Washington and work forward to now.
Well, I'm so excited for it to come out. Kori Schake, Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a great pleasure.
So what's the bottom line? History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. That's what Mark Twain said, not me. In 1970, 4 unarmed students were killed and 9 of them were injured by the National Guard at Kent State University in Ohio. These students were protesting the expansion of the U.S. military footprint from Vietnam into Cambodia, and they were protesting the National Guard presence on their campus. Today, are we watching history repeating itself? I gotta say, it sure feels that way, as President Donald Trump threatens mayors and governors with the deployment of more troops to Democratic Party strongholds across the country. Washington, D.C., Chicago, Portland, Los Angeles, Memphis, and more. So far, no U.S. citizen has been killed by U.S. forces in this country. But if something like that were to happen, what would leaders in both political parties do? What would the courts do? So far, Trump's policies are creating a lot of tension, but not a full-blown crisis. If push comes to shove, that's going to be the real test of America's democracy, whether it can hold through or whether it is retreating. And that's the bottom line.